In southwestern Montana, at the northern edge of Paradise Valley, along the Yellowstone River, one will find the town of Livingston. Stories echo across an ancient landscape, one carved in modern times by a railroad that brought travelers to trails roamed by legends. With a population totaling just over 8,000, Livingston lays claim to one of the highest per capita concentrations of writers in the United States, creating a distinctive literary center. Here, authors live in relationship with an environment at times beautiful and awe-inspiring, as well as harsh and indifferent, engendering profound respect. This respect carries over to fellow citizens, with whom authors share in the day-to-day rewards and trials of life in such a location. An authentic community, deeply connected to the land and one another, Livingston, Montana, calls out for a lit trip. I am Tim Castano, and this is Lit Trip, where we take you on a tour through a location's literary past, present, and future. Writers, scholars, civic leaders, and fans guide us through the history, influences, traditions, and contributions that transform a place into a destination. If you enjoy stories, personalities, and escape, come lose yourself in a lit trip. Livingston's most dominant sound: the wind. This force that defies hyperbole has knocked rail cars off the tracks and tested the wills of residents and visitors. Amidst the howls and whooshes, one will hear names, especially those of the Montana Gang, the writers who put Livingston on the literary map. McGuane, Brodigan, Yortsburg, and Harrison. In this case, Jamie Harrison, author of The Widow Nash, The Center of Everything, and the Jules Clement novels. Jamie's move to Livingston opened the town to her father, Jim Harrison, author of poetry, nonfiction, novels, and novellas, including one of the more popular titles associated with Montana, Legends of the Fall. Your Jules Clement novels take place in Blue Deer, an analog of Livingston, while you set the center of everything in Livingston. In both instances, what do you wish for your readers to understand about your hometown?
I think I wanna disabuse people of the notion that, everybody wears a cowboy hat, that this is sort of either the Wild West or some cliched version of the West, and I think when I started writing the mysteries, I had moved from New York. I grew up in a rural place in Northern Michigan, but I had moved from New York, and maybe I was trying to explain it to them that it was not what they thought that they should put aside their preconceived notions, that it's in fact sort of a weirder experience living in a small town subway because you know everybody and you have to get along with everybody. Your life isn't quite as compartmentalized. You don't only know other people who work at magazines or other people who work in food. And at least when we first moved here, everybody mixed at the same bar. Say, we were young, we were not single, but we were together, but we, moved out and you'd be there with a logger, with a teacher, with a lawyer, with the secret millionaire from down the valley, with a rancher. It was a mix of people, and that's sort of what I've tried to bring to the books. Sort of my lived experience and what I've observed in town. And also that it's not some pastoral dream at all. If you My husband's, was a defense attorney for years and is now a county attorney, and it's a tough place to live in a lot of ways.
You said it's a tough place to live. So, was it like living in a place that you then transform into a fictional world? Does compartmentalization occur in your mind?
Course. Yeah. I'm pretty careful. I try to be careful. I try, I guess, not to compartmentalize too much and not to be too careful, but obviously, uh, I'm careful about legal stuff. I've got a lot of grief after the first book about who was real and who wasn't real and who I used for a model. and I was able to push back pretty well, and people now sort of could show game.
Do you view Livingston differently depending on your character's points of view? Say, Jules Clement or Polly from the center of everything?
Um, in a way, people for a long time asked me who Jules was, who he was modeled on, and Jules is just me. If I could be in bar fights and if I were a 6'2" man and if I were X years younger, so obviously you are your characters. But Polly's is much more my experience. It's a fairly accurate experience of living here. I wrote that novel, um, because of events in real life. I wrote it one summer when a friend of ours had drowned, and every morning I would wake up and I'd hear the helicopter going out again to search the river. It was a babysitter of ours, a boy, and, I just sort of had to do something with it. I'd just lie there, listen to it, watch the helicopters during the day. People would go out and look for him, and ultimately, my mother found him on a dog walk. But in other ways too, Polly's a lot like me, just like the character Alice is in the Jules books. She's cranky, she cooks, she tries to write. I don't know.
You've lived in Livingston for over 30 years. Do you ever still feel like a newcomer? Um, and if so, does that give you a perspective on, say, some of the authors who more recently have settled in the town?
I don't feel like a newcomer. This is sort of an argument around here, who's a local and who isn't a local, and my feeling is that if you manage to live here for winters, you could stop being an out-of-towner, especially given that white people really only settled here 150 years ago. So I've always had a bone to pick with the pioneer crowd, many of whom I love, and people who really have led a tough life, who've ranched, who toughed it out. They're not locals either. The new writer, I'm glad they're here. It makes it interesting. People like Yetta. I adore Yetta. I work with her at Elk River doing the arts and lectures thing. Yeah, it's great. It's great to have a young, vital crowd of people around.
You've said that you did not necessarily set out to make a career of writing, but a life eventually brought you from Livingston, first by way of Michigan and then New York. Um, do you believe you would have become a writer, or at least the writer you have become, had you not moved to Livingston?
I did it out of necessity because I lost my job out here, and there were no other jobs that were gonna pay well enough. I had a small child. I don't know. I think in New York, I probably would have segued to another magazine job. I would have figured out one thing. No, I wouldn't be the same sort of person. I had sort of tried secretly writing a little bit in my 20s in New York, and it was all sort of solipsistic, classic, young, suffering person in Greenwich Village. No, I've become a different person by living here.
You mentioned your father. Your father, James Harrison, is one of the authors most associated with Montana, and he called Livingston home at one point. To follow in your father's footsteps and to do so in a place where he lived and worked, what does that mean to
I don't wanna say not a lot. I mean, I adored my father, and I obviously wouldn't have become a writer without having grown up around one and knowing how to read, how to edit, how to think that way, thinking that it was just something natural to try to do. But the thing is that I moved to New York kind of to get away from Northern Michigan, and I moved to Montana long before my parents moved out here. They'd visited in summers, but they hadn't lived here until they moved out to join my family and my sister's family. My sister followed me too. So in a sense, we moved out here in the '80s and the whole family followed, which is great. And now he's sort of been adopted out here. But I do still think of him as a Michigan writer. And obviously, early on wrote things like Legends of the Fall that sort of put this place on a map for some reason. I don't know why people connect Legends to this area so much because it was filmed in Canada. He was fascinated with the West, and I wouldn't have moved here if he hadn't been friends with Tom McGuane, and everybody followed from there.
While Jamie Harrison and Jim Harrison made their way to Livingston from the Midwest, a not uncommon path for many, writer Scott McMillian, born and raised in the town. Following years abroad as a journalist, Scott returned to Livingston, published his work, Mark of the Grizzly, and founded the Montana Quarterly. In the process, gifting his hometown with one of its most valuable cultural assets. You grew up in Livingston and moved away and eventually came home. Does this dynamic of departure and return influence your perspective on the town?
Think very much. I mean, if I hadn't left, would have had a much more Livingston and Montana and life here. I went away to college, and I thought this was the most incredibly boring and backwards town in the world when I was a kid. I couldn't wait to get out of here. Went away to college, and then foundered a bit. Uh, Got out of college, degree in English literature, and I thought I'd just sort of sign up as a freelance public intellectual. That didn't work. So I did manual labor and then finally got fired from a manual labor job and took off to the Far East. And I got a job teaching there. I lived in the Far East for a few years and traveled around various places, lived in New York. We even lived in Antarctica for a while, traveled around South America. And you know, to come back to Livingston after those sorts of trials, I saw it through very different eyes. My eyes were changed by the travel, I think, more than the years. And the town changed while I was gone too. I came back with an entirely perspective. This is my place now. I find it interesting and attractive and warm. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else.
Is there something authentically Livingston in terms of its literary identity? Does this identity, do you think, change as new writers discover and work in town, or does the identity change the writers who visit and reside in Livingston?
I don't know that there's a literary identity in the 70s. Tom McGuane, Richard Brodigan, Russell Chatham, Jim Harrison. Most of those guys are no longer with us. They get lumped in as a genre of sort of, you know, manly man stuff. They wrote a lot about hunting and fishing and going outside and did it beautifully. But they're not the only ones here. A lot of different writers of very different genres have come through town. Christopher Paolini grew up here. He writes science fiction, fantasy novels. He sells bazillions of them. He grew up here in Livingston. There's a lot of poets here. We have, oh, just off the top of my head, I can think of 6 or 8 published poets living here in town right now. We have 2 poets laureate in town. There was a poetry reading last week where there were 3 poets laureate in the room, current and former. Uh, there's a lot of genres, a lot of different types of writing styles. I think if there's a commonality, it's not the town so much as the landscape around it that shapes people. And it's not just writers, it shapes all of us. I mean, this can be a harsh environment here. You have to adapt or you're not going to make it. We have winters can be incredibly brutal here. You have to learn how to endure it and maybe even enjoy it. Summers are nice, but the economy has always struggled. It's a hard place to make a living. And that physical and economic landscape, I think, shapes people, writers, as much as anything. I wouldn't say there's a Livingston school of writers, but there are a lot of writers here.
Livingston's natural beauty is often cited as a reason for its appeal to authors, and you've written about humanity's relationship with the natural world. So, do you view Livingston's surroundings as a source of osmotic inspiration, a lesson in indifference, or something entirely different?
Osmotic inspiration. I guess that's one way of saying it soaks in. Yeah, it does. I mean, this landscape does soak in. It's not just the scenery, it's the wild animals, fish, wild ecosystems share this world with us. If you're not impressed by those things, you're probably not going to be impressed with living here or pretty much anywhere in Montana. This is not a place in the world where, until very recently, where people came to make money. They came here for the natural surroundings, the wildlife, the scenery, the elbow room, and yeah, I think that sinks into almost everybody who writes in Montana and larger culture as well. I mean, it's part of our culture, our ethos, our news. Every newspaper you pick up almost every day has a story about the environment on the front page. We don't always agree on what to do, but we do talk about it and care about it.
You've said of the Montana Quarterly that our philosophy is pretty simple. Montana is a cool place that hasn't been screwed up yet. We've got a community of writers, photographers, and readers that want to keep it that way. Does that still hold true? And do you think that same philosophy could be applied to Livingston more broadly?
Well, I think it holds true, yes. And I guess I sort of direct it that way. I make the editorial decisions on what to publish and what not to publish. I guess I gravitate people who think somewhat like I do, that we're lucky to be here, but this place is kind of fragile, as is all the natural world, and it needs our caretaking. Or sometimes the best thing we can do is just leave it alone and let nature work the way it's meant to work. There was that famous collection of Montana writing. It's about 30 years old now, Montana, the last best place. And that's become a slogan for copy shops and real estate agencies and all kinds of things over the last few decades. We had a congressman, his name was Pat Williams, and I remember watching him stand up on the floor of the U.S. House, and he said, he was talking about Montana. He said, Montana is the last best place. I truly believe that, but we say that a little sadly, because so much of the rest of the world has been over manipulated and overused. And Montana still has freedom of movement, for wildlife to move. We have clean air, we have clean water. We've got some environmental problems and messes, but all in all, it's a pretty good place, and it needs conscious thought to keep it that way. As I said a minute ago, I think that's it's reflected in our economy and our politics. We talk about that all the time. We don't always agree, but we do talk about it.
Since 2014, the Montana Quarterly has administered the Big Snowy Prize, which recognizes two writers from the state under the age of 30. Through the Big Snowy Prize, what impresses you about the upcoming generations of Montana's writers?
I'm impressed by their tenacity and the world. I'm going to be 70 years old soon. Technology still drags me kicking and screaming, but I look at my grandsons and how comfortable they are with technology and how absorbed they are with social media and that shiny thing in their hands. And to see young people still appreciated with longish forms of writing and the craft of it and the emotion and sweat that goes into doing it well impresses me. That said, some years are better than others in the contest. Some years it's really hard to pick a winner. Some years the entries just don't flow. That might be partly because we do it. Our deadline's April 15th, which is a date that I picked without really thinking about it, but I think that's spring break, and I think a lot of students don't, they sort of lose track of the deadline during spring break. But we've helped launch a couple of careers over the years, people who've been encouraged and emboldened, and seeing their voice amplified through winning that prize and having their work published. And it makes me happy to do that. And several of them come back. I have other assignments for them down the road. We've got just recently. I mentioned that poetry reading. There was a packed house, which is hard to do for a poetry reading in a small town. Standing room only, big audience, and it was in a gallery. It organized a collaboration between poets and visual artists who had the poets would write a poem about a piece of art, and then they paired them on the wall. And almost all those people were, in their 20s and 30s. The Big Snowy Prize is part of that. It's acknowledging and encouraging young writers to think hard and write well.
Are there any writers coming out of Livingston now, younger writers whom we should have an eye out for in the coming years?
Yeah, I think Callan Wink is one. John Henry Hazeltine is another. Adam Baylor, Myers Reese, who's now living in Portland, Oregon, but he grew up here in Livingston. A young woman named Yetta Stein. Yeah, several others.
You have written how a Google search could explain Livingston's background and backstory, but it can't tell you who we are. Is this a question that can be answered?
Well, the Google dump will get you news stories and statistics and uh, things like that. It won't tell you what it's like to live here. It won't tell you what it's like to interact with people of various occupations and backgrounds and perspective, and how we almost always work together when we need to. When the river floods, somebody's house burns down. It always amazes me how this community comes together and puts aside our differences when something terrible happens. Who we are, I don't know. We've got 8,500 people here. I think you'd get 8,500 different answers. What we are is a community that still functions. We've been discovered by Hollywood and rich people and sort of digital nomads who've put down roots here or at least rented a house for a while. Most of them seem to be pretty good people. A lot of them become part of the community. Others are drifters. I mean, this is a railroad town. It had a transient population for many years. Remember responding to challenge from a friend, I looked at my high school yearbook, and he said, figure out how many of those people that you graduated high school with were there all through school, and it was really only about half. And a lot of us old timers here have I think, a mistaken assumption that we've all been here all the time, and the new people are causing the problems. Well, things have changed in this town. It's hard to buy certain things because Bozeman's just over the hill. People drive over there to shop, but so our retail scene has changed drastically, and a lot of people complain about that. But the town still works. I mean, I can get a cup of coffee, go to the post office, stop in the bank. I probably stop for a brief conversation with 3 or 4 people and do it all on foot in 15 minutes. It's it's still a pretty easy town to live in if you can afford the housing. That's gotten tough, as it has in most of the pretty places in the world. People have moved there, whether it's a village in Burgundy or a village in Montana. The problems with mobile wealth are very similar all over the world. Back to an earlier question, let's not screw it up. Let's cooperate with each other. Let's figure out a way to keep it the last best place. We can do that through cooperation. We can do it by thinking, by writing, by reading, by listening to each other.
Livingston's legendary authors share the space with new generations of writers, like Yetta Stein. A poet, Yetta leads one of the town's most vital literary resources, Elk River Arts and Lectures, which honors the region's long, storied history, while supporting current and emerging writers with workshops, symposia, and solidarity.
In a statement on the organization's literary heritage, Elk River Arts and Lectures highlights the connection between literature and place. Could you say more about this relationship? What in Livingston helps shape writers? And is it the natural beauty, the culture, the history, probably all of the above?
It's a great question, and I think it's one we all think about a lot. I think place always shapes writers, and so it isn't just Livingston as a place that shapes the writers who live here. I think anywhere we live, writers are being satiated and fed by those places, and those places seep into our work, whether we like it or not. I think that the natural beauty of Livingston absolutely inspires awe. And, I think we're all sort of writing odes to the river and the mountains and public lands and access and space. But I think my secret opinion is that the wind is really what inspires a lot of us, or makes us all feel crazy enough to write, to do this audacious thing, which is storytelling and writing poems. Wind is sort of this feature of Livingston. It's one of the windier places in the U.S., and it just rips and roars year round, but especially in our long, long, dark winters. And I think the wind, and especially the sound it creates, it rattles houses, and you find trash cans sort of thrown about when you wake up in the morning. And it's just this place where the wind is sort of a motivating and crazying testament to what we do.
Shifting from the link between authors and place to the bond among one another, how might you describe the literary community in Livingston?
It's such a great community. I would describe it as storied and depthful, and it has a very big capacity for newness. It's not a community with a lot of scarcity. I've found as a young person and as a young writer in Livingston, I've found that whatever I start to build and bring energy around, people who have been here 20, 30, 40 years are excited to invest and engage in it. There's not this sort of gripped mentality onto the old ways. The literary community here is welcoming and earnest and excitable, and really likes to honor those who made this place a sort of a literary haven. So Jim Harrison and Tom McGuane and Gats Yortzberg, those writers that were here far before, and many that I'm not listing, that were here far before us. We have a literary community that really wants to continue to celebrate those people and invest in the next generation of those writers.
Elk River Arts and Lectures aspires to honor Livingston's past while dreaming our way into the future. How do your programmatic offerings actualize this mission?
It's a great question. So I think the part of honoring our heritage comes with our lecture series, bringing in writers that are connected to place, maybe not our place, but connected to a place of their own, and who are connected to our community. So we have a wonderful board of directors that's well connected in the literary world and is always thinking up new ideas of who to bring to Livingston, who our community needs to hear from or would like to hear from. And that feels like this way of taking care of the writers who are currently doing the work and then the writers that came before. I think in terms of honoring the sort of next generation or cultivating that next generation of literary giants, we send poets into the fourth grade classrooms to teach poetry. We reach into the more rural corners of Park County and Gardner and Wilsall to get poetry lessons, journalism lessons, even sometimes fiction writing lessons in front of those kids. Supporting our public school teachers is paramount to us. We offer all sorts of free writing workshops. We partner closely with our Senior Citizen Center to do all ages writing workshops, and that's a really lovely intergenerational component that I feel a deep passion around. And then we also have our Elk River Writers Workshop. It's once a year out at Chico Hot Springs, and you apply, and we have a wonderful faculty. It's run by a writer named C. Marie Furman, and it brings writers of all ages and ilks and sort of professional levels to the same place to engage and discuss and create among these beautiful scenic places, right at the base of Immigrant Peak. So I think our offerings really work to span all sorts of different writers. Just this week we launched a two-part playwriting workshop with a brand new nonprofit here in Livingston, that's brought the Fringe Festival model to Park County. So new works, plays that are put on once a year. We're partnering closely with that organization to get people writing plays. So I think even thinking beyond our more traditional genre of fiction and nonfiction and poetry, we want to think about all the ways people are engaging with writing, especially now in this age of AI, in this age of kids having AI write their essays. We want to remind people, even remind myself, that creation is an act of God. Creation is the opposite of war. It's the most important thing we can be doing right now.
What emerging writers from Livingston would you recommend we keep an eye on?
My gosh, I just love this question. There are so many that I feel so inspired by. So Rose Damaris, I mean, emerging is such a funny term, but Rose Damaris is a wonderful poet who spends part of her year here. I would definitely keep an eye on Mallory Rice, who comes from journalism, but is sort of embarking on a journey with fiction, and she's just phenomenal. Amy Talcott will sort of fingers crossed. You'll see more of her in the coming few years. Tessa Mokel, who's a poet and who is just writing amazing things. Jack Wickham, who is a comedian. He's actually in Bozeman, but he's tied to Livingston through mutual connections and friendships. Alex Speed, so many wonderful writers who just inspire me all the time to keep going. And I do want to give a big shout out to my dear friend Mike Summerby, who in Bozeman started a space called Pulphead, and he's launching a magazine, an independent magazine called Anemone. He's a wonderful freelance writer, and he's also working to really cultivate community in these audacious and inspiring ways. My favorite writer to recommend in Livingston is Earl Craig, but he's been our Montana Poet Laureate. I don't think we can consider him emerging, but he is. If I were to recommend one Park County poet, it would be Earl.
What sites and experiences would you recommend to a literary minded visitor to Livingston?
Oh, what a beautiful question. So, our nonprofit, Elk River Arts and Lectures, partners closely with a bookstore here in town, Elk River Books, run by Mark Bodine and Andrea Peacock. Andrea Peacock is Doug Peacock's partner. So, continuing his literary legacy is very important to our organization. Um, Mark and Andrea actually founded our organization back in 2013, and now we just partner closely with the bookstore. So I would absolutely recommend stopping by Elk River Books, mostly used and rare books. It's fun to get Mark, on a podium about the oldest book he has in the shop. He'll give you a tour and sort of show you around. But I think I think for anyone looking for a literary experience in Livingston, I think you ought to be getting in the river in January. I think there's nothing like the cold Yellowstone River. It's slow and it's icy and there's no one else there, and there is nothing that will make you feel like a writer in Park County, like getting your body into the cold, cold, longest undammed river in the contiguous United States.
You were born in Montana. Do you believe native writers like yourself own a distinct voice attributed to your origin? Is there a discernible difference between an author raised in the state and one who migrates to Montana?
It's such an interesting question. I mean, I bristle at the word native because, there are so many indigenous and capital N native writers who live and are sort of integral to the Montana voice and the Montana experience. So I do just want to acknowledge that piece of it. I was born in Missoula and raised in Missoula, and I think that being from Missoula is a very important part of who I am. I love a town with a river in it, and that's why I live in Livingston now. Um, I don't know that I could sort of do a blind taste test of two writers and tell you one that was born in Montana and one that wasn't. I think being of place and honoring place can be one and the same. And I'm always, I think it's like a defense mechanism of my heart when someone interesting and fun moves to Livingston, I sort of test them and I'm like, "Oh, how long are you gonna stay? Are you gonna leave us behind?" And when I feel like they're gonna stay and that they're invested in our community, it's so easy to love them and read their work and think about them in what they're doing from an artistic capacity. And so I think that being of a place or being from a place, I actually think I think you can fall in love with Livingston really quickly, and you can stay here and you can leave and then come back. It's this vortex, it's this black hole that everyone I've ever met has wanted to be tethered to, and kept within. So there's I'm sure there is a difference, and I'm sure when I write about places that I don't live or, places that I have lived but I'm not from, I'm sure that, it's a different reverence or affection I'm showing to Portland or Washington, DC, or Turkey, but I do think that anyone can write a love letter to Montana, anyone can write an ode to Park County or Livingston, and that those perspectives are actually just as interesting and compelling to me as those of us who were sort of born and raised in Montana. It's just luck that I arrived here. So I can't fault anyone for moving here, as long as they want to invest in our community and make this place sort of better and safer than it has been.
You once wrote, "It takes a really long time to find your voice and an even longer time to find your people." This is a reminder to myself and to you. Has Livingston helped you find your voice and your people?
Oh, nice. I don't remember writing that. It's great you found it. Um, yes, yes, I think an easy answer is yes, Livingston has helped me find my voice and my people. A couple years ago, I was, in the middle of finishing my MFA, and I was living in Livingston, and I was feeling like I need to move to New York City to be a writer. I was feeling this itch. I was in my mid-20s, and, I think it's an itch a lot of people feel throughout their life, but especially young people feel. And my partner looked at me and he said, "Hey, you can move to New York City, and moving to New York City will not make you a writer. And so why don't you just try? Why don't you just try while you're here and see what happens?" And so it was really good advice, and I did. I emailed the then executive director of Elk River Arts and Lectures named Amy Zanoni, who is now a dear friend. And I still look at the email sometimes with absolute affection for that younger self who was seeking community and voice. And I said, Amy, I just want to be involved in the writing community here. Tell me what I can do. And Amy is such a good example of how so many people are in Livingston, is just operating with an abundant mentality, inviting you to the table and making the table bigger so that we can all sit and eat and nourish one another. And that was my first foray into Elk River Arts and Lectures, which has become integral to my community. Nourishes me in so many ways and has introduced me to so many writers that have helped me develop my craft and my voice. And so I think we're living in a real season of constriction and protecting ourselves and not reaching out to the stranger and not inviting the stranger in. We're a few weeks out from Passover. I'm like a half Jewish girl from Montana. But, we need to be inviting the stranger in. Elijah is at the door, and I feel that so much in Livingston. The invitation is always there and open. The table is always full and brimming. There's always enough for everyone. In fact, there's more than enough for everyone. And I think Livingston and Park County is absolutely a place that's helped me tap into those threads of community and finding my people, which has led me to a more literary voice.
Elk River Arts and Lectures receives guidance from its board of directors, an impressive assemblage of writers, artists, and community leaders. A member of the advisory board, Gretel Ehrlich, has paved a noteworthy literary path with nonfiction, fiction, and poetry, along the way garnering such honors as the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award for Distinguished Prose and a Whiting Award, among others. You travel a good deal, with the destinations serving as the subjects of your work and perhaps informing your overall writing. Do your travels influence your sense of Livingston, and do you view the town differently when you return?
Well since I'm often in the high Arctic, so I've spent 23 years going to northwestern Greenland. Not lately, but in earlier days. So, yes. So, in Livingston, it's much warmer, and, it is just there's just something about it that, is so welcoming, and there's always you can always go to the Murray bar and have a glass of beer or wine and see Jamie Harrison or Maggie McGuane or somebody, and, I'm just always happy to be back, that's all. Although I don't actually live in Livingston, I live about 40 minutes away, but it's my town center, yeah. So, I go to kind of extreme places, so it's the places I go, either Africa or Greenland, don't really correlate with Livingston or anything in Montana, except that it's home, and there's people to talk to who are worldly and have been places and understand whatever it is we all have to say about our experience, so that's really great.
In The Future of Ice, as well as in other works, you explore your relationship with winter, and you
Mhm.
write, "Winter is refuge and deathbed, monastery and ivory tower, cave and ghost." Does one need to appreciate the seasons and the surroundings to connect to a location like Livingston?
Oh, I definitely think so. I mean, it's really all about being, as they say, awake and aware. And yes, Livingston's a tiny little town on the Yellowstone River with mountains in the back and a little ski place and a great bookstore and a couple of good restaurants and bars. But what really, holds us or should hold us to a place is what's all around. I mean, the bird life, the fish life, the varying weathers, the capriciousness of spring, the, that horrific heat of summer because of climate change. the horror of the coal trains going through the middle of town carrying coal to, I suppose, China. Uh, you've gotta just dig into everything that comes at you. Otherwise, are you alive? If and because I don't live in town, I've always lived really rurally, and so, each season has its a deep effect on my psyche and my body and the chores I have to do to keep warm or to keep cool or to grow whatever I'm growing that, I custom graze cattle here where I live in. I go out every day and look at the grasses and which ones are surviving the drought and which ones aren't, and what the incoming weather is, and how to kind of think about how many animals you can graze and when to bring them on and when to take them off and where the birds are nesting and what the pronghorn antelope are doing and what the deer are doing and great bird life here, sandhill cranes and geese and herons and all the songbirds that come through here. So I mean, it doesn't matter if you're in town or not. It is. We don't go out to nature. We are nature and we are in it all the time. We breathe in weather, we exhale carbon dioxide. We we're part of the whole thing and it's really important to register that.
In Unsolaced, you write, loneliness ended that night, whooshed away by the embrace of strangers. Has the embrace of strangers followed you as your journeys have expanded, and does Livingston allow you to balance solitude with community?
Absolutely. I mean, so for much of my adult life, I lived in rural Wyoming, not too far from here as the raven flies, but um, and and it was really loneliness that propelled me here because I was on the phone with Tom McGuane one day, and he said, "For God's sakes, move to Montana. You've been in Wyoming long enough, like 40 something years, and you need to come up here so you'll have someone to talk to." And so I did. I always do what Tom tells me to do. And, and so, yeah, it's been incredible. And, really, I mean, yeah, Tom and Lori McGuane have been friends for a long time. Nan Newton and Dave Grusin, who live nearby, have been friends for a long time. And of course, I knew Jim Harrison. I knew a lot of that old crowd, though wasn't really a part of, how they lived and stuff. But uh, but the Elk River Books was really, a meeting place for, new friends and old friends and writers that we brought in, and that has been really sort of life-saving for me, even though, you don't have to be around people all the time, you don't have to, go out for dinner every night, I just know that people are here and we can meet up or not, and we respect each other's privacy and solitude, but, solitude is overrated. You have to understand that Thoreau went to the Emerson's house every night for dinner. I mean, let's get real here. It's a great gathering place, and, obviously has been for a long time, and although I didn't live here in the sort of heyday of Jim Harrison and that crowd, but I visited and I knew what was going on, and so it's good to be here. Yeah, and I could talk also about meeting Jim Harrison, and when Solace came out in 1984, I think, or 85, whatever it was, um, I got a call from Jim saying, "I'm coming to visit you at your ranch." And Dan Gerber's driving, thank God he was driving and not Jim, and they drank their way from Michigan to my ranch in Shell, Wyoming, and showed up and stayed for 4 days. Of course, I was just terrified that my food and my cooking and my wine collection was not gonna meet their standards, but it didn't matter. Of course, they arrived with their own cases of wine, and we had a fantastic time, and that was the first time I'd met Jim. He liked my book, and he just decided to come visit, so and I would say, that sort of, it tells you something about the writing community that is represented in Livingston. It's this kind of really deep respect for each other's work, and also a willingness to put yourself out and go meet each other and have some drinks and talk and have fun. Mostly have fun.
So you serve as an advisory board member of Elk
Mhm.
River Arts and Lectures, an entity that encapsulates Livingston as a community of artists. What has that organization in Livingston more widely given you as a writer?
A place to go to hear amazing writers and some local, but, I mean, it was the year before last, I I went in, it's usually a Thursday night reading, and Ilya Kaminsky was giving a reading. I mean, he's from right, I mean, from the Ukraine. Just a brilliant poet who teaches at Princeton, who's, basically a refugee from the Ukraine and is also deaf, and he just gave this extraordinary performance, and, I mean, when he walked in, I said, "Ilya, what are you doing here? How did you get here?" And he said, "Well, they just said they'd send me a plane ticket, so I came."
Um, in Island the Universe Home, you write, nature abhors a vacuum, and if I can only walk with sufficient carelessness, I am sure to be filled. At this stage in your career, having achieved so much, are you still able to walk with sufficient carelessness?
Yeah, I thought about that. It's a really bad choice of words because, well, we know what we mean by carelessness, which means, laid back, but when you think about the word actually, it's sort of awful. Like, of course, I walk with total care in that I care about everything that I see and is under my feet, et cetera, et cetera. So I would change that word to saunter, the sort of Thoreauvian word saunter. I, yes, I walk every day, or I hike, or I ski around. I don't join hiking groups. I always do these things alone. And um, I often go the same routes every day that take an hour or two and try to see all the differences from day to day, hour to hour, whether it's morning or evening, or I sometimes take walks at night. So, yes, I saunter because, yeah, the vacuum the non-existent vacuum is so full. It's sort of the fullness, emptiness paradigm. Everything that's empty is full, and everything that's full is empty. The it- there's just so much to see everywhere at every hour of the day that um, it should be everybody's practice, if possible, to spend some time, however much time you can give to it, to basically doing nothing. There's a wonderful book from 18th century Japan called Essays in Idleness, which I love. I just the joy of what I call carelessness, the joy of sauntering, the joy of just looking around, doing nothing is, incredibly nourishing and important. And it's all about kind of giving yourself over to the other instead of saying, I want to listen to this music now. I want to da 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 da, sort of the digital me world where you keep choosing exactly what you want, sort of the menu of life. Well, I say just throw that away.
As Yetta Stein noted, Elk River Arts and Lectures spawn from Elk River Books. one of Livingston's most prominent independent bookstores. The sale of rare and antiquarian publications accounts only for a portion of Elk River's contributions. The store fills the role of public good, hosting signings, lectures, readings, and performances. Elk River Books syncs with Livingston's literary rhythms thanks to its founder, Mark Bodine, a poet, writer, and theater artist.
You grew up in Michigan, traveled extensively, and moved to Livingston improper, to borrow your term, in 2011. Do you feel as if you have become a Livingston writer, so to speak? Or is Livingston's literary identity organically a product of those with diverse backgrounds who settle in the town?
Yeah. So I guess I moved to Montana in 2008, but I was out in Paradise, what we call Paradise Valley, aptly named, or at least it was. There's a nice cachet that comes with being called a Livingston writer or a Montana writer. And I've really enjoyed since being here that I get labeled that by, if somebody's doing a promo for an event I'm doing, and they say, Montana writer Mark Bodine, that feels good. You're in very good company when you're called a Livingston writer, for sure. I don't know if I personally think of myself as being any type of any modifier. In fact, I often kind of rail against any modifier coming before the word poet when people, rather than being primarily a poet, they have modifiers in front of the word in their bio. And it feels to me like they're sort of implying that they're a poet to serve some other ends, or some political, agenda you may have, good or bad, usually good. But for me, it's I just like being a poet. That said, I do feel like there is a very strong identity to be a Livingston writer. A lot of the writers here, and it really feels like what a Livingston writer mostly is somebody who sort of blew in from somewhere else. The community of writers, I think part of what joins us is that most of us are from somewhere else. We all kind of have a little bit of that vagrant energy to us. For some reason, a lot of us come from Michigan in the Midwest. Jim Harrison and Tom McGuane are Michigan guys, but also myself, my cousin Doug Peacock, Callan Wink, who's a fantastic novelist, that lives here in town now, but is originally from Michigan. So if there is like a character that one would call that's a Livingston writer, I I feel like quite often a big part of that character is something of a vagrant, something of a wandering soul who's ended up here.
Your store, Elk River Books, anchors Livingston's literary community, particularly through the events you host. Do you ever view your work less as that of a bookseller and more as the curator of a public good or cultural utility?
I think that's primarily how I view the work we do. That it is. I like that phrase, a public good and a cultural utility. That's nice. Bringing as writers, it's always been super important to support writers with our bookstore, but also just that idea of bringing writers and readers together. These two groups that are absolutely dependent upon each other. They have this mutualistic, symbiotic relationship. You can't, they can't exist without each other. And so to be able to provide a place where we can bring those groups together and really promote both of them and support both of them is a huge part of what we do and why we have Elk River Books. Um, but also, even with the books, the actual book selling side of it that supposedly we need to do to stay in business, I feel like that's also part of a community service, or a preserving and defending the book as an artifact, and the freedom to read and the encouragement to read and to treasure literary productions. It's a beautiful thing when you can take this beautiful book and get it into the right hands, into the hands of someone who's gonna treasure it and, honor it and pass it down to their children or. So I do feel everything we do is toward that more, community-based and cultural-based goal, um, which makes sense because neither of us are good capitalists at all. We always joke that anarchists make terrible capitalists. There are magical places, independent bookstores. They are a place where people can gather and celebrate all the things that a book is and can be of, just telling our stories and passing our stories down and being inspired by other people's stories, to have the courage to write our own story or tell our own story. That's magical stuff that, um, you don't get at a corporate chain.
What changes have you observed in Livingston's literary scene and its writers, say, over the past 15 years?
Yeah. I feel like I arrived at the tail end of, um, the first big wave of people that were called the Montana Gang, like Harrison, McGuane, Richard Brautigan, Gatz Yortzberg, um, and numerous others, and then also a lot of non-writers, other actors, musicians, and um, artists, visual artists. I kind of came in at the tail end of it. Those guys were all kind of aging out. um, and since I've been here, many of them have died. We've lost all of those, kind of anchors to what the Livingston literary scene meant. So it's been this big transitional time. Partly it's been great seeing a lot of other writers who maybe were a little in the shade now having some sunlight to flourish. Um, and I don't mean that, in terms of like, oh, these big famous people were blocking them. Because I do think like if we're that forest metaphor, the new trees are absolutely dependent on the old trees for protecting the soil and protecting them from storms and all of that. So it's definitely again a mutualistic relationship. But when those patches of open sky open up, it's your job then to start growing more. And I feel like we've seen that with Jamie Harrison, Jamie Potenberg, um, but also Callan Wink, who I mentioned before, is a fantastic novelist, and a lot of other just younger people. Michael Earl Craig is an incredible poet who lives here, but also from Ohio, another Midwesterner. Um, and there's a bunch of younger people who don't have books out yet, first books out, but I know they will, and they're going to be great because they're just doing really wonderful work and publishing in journals and magazines and maybe working toward a book. But I feel like it's still going strong. It's still a very vibrant community. We probably don't party as hard as the old guys did back in the day. Things were a little more wild then. Uh, Now a lot of the writers who are around now are um, they're balancing their writing with family and careers um and that might keep them out of the saloons just a little bit more than the old the old days.
You have written, a good writing prompt is like a radio dial, filtering out the static and tuning in the station of the poem. You also have written about the power of listening in poetry, and you, in fact, teach a workshop on that topic. So I've heard Livingston emits many distinct sounds, particularly the wind. Do you believe at least some of the town's appeal to writers lies in its natural prompts, music, and soundtrack?
Sure. I really think the key, at least for me, um is finding the music wherever you are. This music is everywhere. Um, and it's our job as writers to train ourselves to listen. Um, when I whenever I talk about listening, because I also do theater, I direct plays, and I always talk to my actors about listening, and it's always this idea of whole body listening. So it's not just a function of your ears; it's a function of every sense you have, and also your imagination and your creativity and your memory and your, um, you know, fanciful ideas, whatever you can use to bring things in that are happening out in the world. Um, and for me, music is really what it comes down to. And the other side of that is trusting the music of the poem. That the poem n- knows what it needs to say, and the way that you will find what the poem needs to say is by trusting the music of the poem and following it and getting out of your own way and letting the music of the poem guide things. And then the poem will say what it needs to say, which is also what you need to say, because otherwise it wouldn't be your poem. Um, and so on one sense, I'd say every place has music for poets to listen to. For me personally, Livingston definitely has much more um, music I connect with than say some suburban subdivision somewhere where life has mostly been commodified out of the area. But in Livingston, you've got this wonderful mix of these old brick buildings and alleyways. You've got the surrounding mountains. You've got the river, birds and trees, um, and the kind of ever present railroad going through, the train coming through, and all of that creates its own music, its own rhythms that I have found to be very, it works for me.
You edited Unearthing Paradise, Montana Writers in Defense of Greater Yellowstone, an anthology of poems and essays and fiction that honors Greater Yellowstone's ecosystem's vast natural assets. So, does this work speak to a broader communal activism among local writers, especially when it relates to protecting an environment essential to their craft?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. That book, I was one of the co-editors. It was with Max Yortzberg, whose dad Gatz or William Yortzberg was one of these Montana Gang originals, and Sebring Davis, a journalist and writer here. Um, so the three of us put out this book to stop some gold mines that were trying to come in, um, just up above Chico and also right on the border of Yellowstone, outside of Gardner. Um, and when we put the word out that we were assembling this book, every writer, that we reached out to instantly responded with their support. Um, and at first, I was thinking, well, which writers would want to contribute something? Your natural thought is like, well, the people who are writing environmental work, people who are nature poets or environmental, activist writers, or um, and it turned out that every single writer here um, recognized the value of this environment, of the wildness of this area, even if you know they wrote murder mysteries or things that you might never picture having an environmental background to or an edge to. It really is, I think, part of what makes the writers here. What your that idea that the environment is essential to their craft. Um,
Is there a poem of yours that best captures your relationship with Livingston?
Probably Railroad Doves. That's in my book. It's in Life List, which is a field guide to birds and poetry. It's also on a CD I did called From Coltrane to Coltrane. Um, that poem, I don't know if you want to hear it or
Yes, please. Yeah.
okay, let me do that. I wrote this on the back deck of Glenn's bar, which now it's called the Fainting Goat. Um, but when it was Glenn's, it was definitely the writers' hangout. It's where when Harrison would come into town in the last several years of his life, he would sit out on the deck there and kind of hold court. um, Railroad doves. One could do worse than spend the day watching them. Not quite rock doves and not quite pigeons, evolving along the tracks, feeding with each passing grain train, amber in prairie sunlight. The grain is long since gone, and it may be some genetic memory keeps them clustering on these piles of death stone, filling the long line of the coal train, cutting our town in half. The wheeze of air brakes powering, slap of wings like an eight of spades in the spokes of a bicycle, and the squealing departure begins, casting off the birds and taking the poison dust to the next town. The wind brings the stench of coal. I take it into my lungs, knock a few seconds off the end of my life, breathe out and in again, out and in again. The railroad doves gather and swirl to a nearby rooftop, await the next train. Late tonight, a dragon will swallow the moon, heedless of the greed that swallows the world, one train at a time, and one could do worse than to watch the doves.
As evidenced by the variety of titles at Elk River Books, Livingston's writers address many subjects in several genres and styles. Some unsurprisingly prominent themes: travel and adventure. If ever a place could feed restless souls drawn to challenges and frontiers, Livingston would offer such a home, as it has for Tim Cahill the past several decades. Founding editor of Outside Magazine, a contributor to National Geographic Adventure magazine, and author of such titles as Road Fever, a high-speed travelogue, Cahill very much earned his membership in the Montana Gang.
In discussing your relationship with Livingston, you have said, "You can't fire a cannon from a canoe." Could you share more about what the aphorism says about the town?
Well, I see it as a solid base. My my work had me traveling all over the world for, um, for stories, and I could always come back to Livingston and expect to uh, be kind of in this place where people knew me. Not everybody likes me. Some people, uh, dislike some of the things I write, and we know that. But the cool thing about Livingston is, even with the divisive politics, it feels like kind of a fire-free zone. You go into a bar and you have a drink, and there's a guy who's mm, maybe doesn't uh, think the way you do about politics, and you're not going to talk about that. You're going to talk about how the fishing was today or something like that. And so Livingston is a place that I can always come back to. I know where I am. I know where I'm sitting. And I grew up in a small town, and I guess I'm a small town kind of guy.
So you moved to Livingston before the town's reputation as a literary center had taken hold. Do you have a perspective on how its identity has evolved over the decades, both as a witness and a contributor?
When I came out here the first time, which was February of 79, the sun blacked out of the sky, and then the light came out, and that's when I met uh, Russell Chatham and Tom McGuane and uh, William Yartsburg and Richard Brodigan, who I actually known in San Francisco a little bit. When I say the sun blotted out of the sky, it was a total solar eclipse of the sun in February of 1979. Uh, by I was working for Outside Magazine at the time, and all of these writers here, McGuane, Yortsburg, Rodigan, Chatham, uh, they were all working for Outside Magazine or doing a piece for Outside Magazine. I was supposed to be covering the total eclipse of the sun, but part of my job was to be sure we could recruit these guys. And after I saw the town and the river, I thought, I would like to move there. And it worked pretty well. People thought that I could see into the futures because I move out there, and then they had this thing where I could get manuscripts into New York in one day. It's called FedEx. And then after that, there was fax machines, and you could almost do them, uh, in a day. And then, of course, we have the internet, all those kind of things. And people think, yeah, Tim figured that out in 1979. No, I didn't. I think one of the things you have to remember with Livingston, uh, I originally thought that, oh, there might even be a story here of these literary types and hostile town people, uh, some kind of cross currents. Nothing like that happened. Nothing at all. But what you have to remember is after the four writers that I talked about, and Jim Harrison was a frequent visitor at that time, I was the next in line. And at that time, the town is basically agriculture and railroad. That's where the money came from. And the railroad pulled out in about 1984. Um, Huge, big shops. The town lost about 5% of the population in a year or two. I bought my house in Livingston for a comically small amount of money. The place was depressed, but that's the kind of place, a beautiful river, mountains, with the glaciers shining on their shoulders and glittering rivers, and cheap houses, cheap rent, and that draws your various artists. So um, when I came, uh, I was a guy who made my money from New York and Los Angeles and spent it in Livingston. Uh, I was a welcome addition to the community. And it became very artsy, as these kind of places do when they're cheap, beautiful. We've got 14 art galleries in Livingston. That's like one art gallery for every 500 people. So then other writers came out. You had the first group, the McGuane, Harrison, Brodigan, and Yortsburg. Then you had me. Then you had a bunch of people were writers who kind of knew that this was going on in this town. And one of our resident writers, Toby Thompson, wrote a story about it. I believe New York Times could have been. So that's pretty much the way I see it. People come to Livingston, and you might know that it's a very windy town, very windy. Um, I checked the automatic meteorological sites from 2000 to 2010. Livingston recorded the highest wind blast in the country, second only to a place called Guadalupe Peak in New Mexico, which I looked at, and it's just a mountain peak. No, we're a town here that gets the wind. And as you may have heard, people always like to tell you this, it has blown railroad cars off the track. We've got gusts of over 100 miles an hour. It's not unusual. And a lot of people can't take that, and are, as we say, gone with the wind.
In Lost in My Own Backyard, you write, "The wilderness that is Yellowstone Park affirms our mortality. That is why walking its trails makes us feel so damn alive." Does Livingston's appeal to you as a writer, especially as an adventure travel writer, lie in that observation?
Yes. I- it's the beauty is there, but you aren't the apex predator uh, in uh, in the Livingston area. There's few grizzlies around Livingston, but if you go into the park, you have to pay attention, and that that kind of, to me, it's a focus. Is everything I look at, knowing that I am not the apex predator here. It seems to have sharper edges and brighter colors, and you can feel that when you're walking around. Does that inform my writing? I don't know. I can't say.
You'd already mentioned some of your peers and how you had arrived in Livingston with a certain generation of Montana authors, including Tom McGuane and Jim Harrison and others. Um, has the idea of a Montana author changed in the present day, or do certain elements remain universal and intransient?
Well, I think for Tom McGuane, he got there first, um, and he stayed for the fishing. He said, "Well, I love the fishing, and it doesn't have to be an expedition for me. I'm here." Um, and Tom may be the last of the gentleman outdoor writers, um, horses, fishing, hunting. He writes well about those things. Tom, for for everybody who reads Tom, it's his sentences are, I mean, he's a writer's writer. The sentences just ring. So there is that outdoor gentleman kind of writer. And no, that's not a lot of that is going on. I mean, Thomas Goltz was in town, or was a writer here, passed away, dear friend. But, he's off in Azerbaijan covering the conflict with Armenia. And Marianne Vollers is helping Billie Jean King write her book, or Hillary Clinton. A local boy, Larry Lauren, a well-known archaeologist, wrote a book called Homeland. John Tolliver is writing about John Hay or George Bird Grinnell, big things, and doing months worth of research in libraries. So no, the idea that a Montana writer is of a mold, it doesn't fit here.
One of the most frequently cited lines attributed to you reads as follows: "A journey is best measured in friends rather than miles." Would the same sentiment apply to your time in Livingston?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Um, I mean, I've been there for well over 45 years. I've got great friends that we uh, we managed to survive our 30s. We might have been a little bit. We might have partied a bit, but these are still my friends. These are still people I know. I can trust them. I got to tell you about that line of "measured in friends." That was written uh, in the acknowledgments to my book Road Fever, in which I drove from the tip of South America to the tip of Alaska in a record amount of time. But and then people always say, when they hear the concept of the book, um, "Why don't you stop and smell the roses?" Well, there were 70 or 80 people there that I had to thank. You had to actually go down to those countries and scout the routes and grease the borders, and so there was a lot of help there, and that's where that line comes from. But I'm glad people like it. I'm glad I'm oft quoted in that line, because I hope that uh, helps people travel with the right ideas.
Livingston, Montana, a small town large with inspiration, stories, talent, and personalities. A community at the crossroads of the past and the future. A community continuing to lead readers and visitors along a meaningful lit trip.